Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Strategoi video. Ryan here with another solo MathHammer installment, but this time we'll be taking our first steps into MathHammer analysis by giving you all a relatively simple Warscroll to examine and breaking it down just thoroughly enough to set the stage for both relevant back to basics and deep dive content yet to come. That said, we'll be splitting this initial Warscroll analysis into two parts in two separate videos. The first pertaining to the offensive side of melee combat, and the second to the defensive half, so look out for that follow-up video in the near future. But just a reminder before diving in, if you want to keep in touch, join our Strategoi Discord, where Jonas himself and I will be happy to chat with you there. And please do subscribe if you want to stay up to date. So, seeing as the Lumineth book is chock full of in-additions and unique rules, we've figured that starting there might be a bit too off into the deep end, and our backup plan of Stormcast Eternals, being the poster boys of the Mortal Realms that they are, still managed to be a little too complex for what we were going for. So instead, keeping things near and dear to my own heart, we've opted for an Elven Warscroll still, but this time out of Cities of Sigmar. The unit we've chosen is one that's simultaneously quite strong, yet gracefully simple in its design execution, as it's easily one of the most well-rounded basic infantry units in the game. And of course, I'm talking about Phoenix Guard. Here's a quick summary of what's to come in this video. First, we'll have a quick look at the Phoenix Guard Warscroll itself, giving it a full read before plowing on into deeper MathHammer analysis. Then we'll tackle the ins and outs of melee damage calculation, followed by an in-depth look at common buffs that unit has access to, all before leaving you on a cliffhanger awaiting the defensive half of our analysis for our next MathHammer installment. Let's first take a quick look at the various elements of the Phoenix Guard Warscroll, taking note of those bits that are most pertinent to the present conversation, and leaving the rest for another time. Beginning with the familiar stats wheel, we see that like nearly all Elven infantry, Phoenix Guard have a wounds characteristic of 1 and a movement characteristic of 6 inches. Additionally, they have a bravery of 7 and a respectable basic save characteristic of 4+. For these initial analysis videos, we're only really concerned with their wounds and save characteristics though, but of course we'll be addressing them in the follow-up video to this one. Next, let's take a look at everything but their weapon profile, as I often find that analyzing the melee and shooting profiles before having read through all the special rules can leave you with an incomplete sense of what those weapons can actually do. So, like most cities units, Phoenix Guard have a champion model, the Keeper of the Flame, granting +1 attack on his melee weapon, a standard bearer granting +1 bravery to the unit, which again we're ignoring for this video, and a musician or drummer that grants +1 for the unit's charge rolls, notably not run rolls as well, but beside the point, seeing as this analysis also won't be covering movement of any sort. Furthermore, we have a special rule entitled Emboldened, granting the unit battle shock immunity if wholly within 12 inches of their synergistic hero class, the Anointeds, of which we have 3 variants, one on foot and the other 2 mounted on phoenixes. But the last and much more notorious rule on their Warscroll is called Witness to Destiny, and grants the unit a 4+ ward save, which again we'll save for the follow-up video. As you can see, after having looked through all of their extra abilities, none of these additional rules are truly oriented around their melee profile, so now we can feel confident in finally centering our attention there. The Phoenix Guard's melee weapon, the Phoenix Halberd, has a range of 2 inches, 2 attacks, and a 3+ to both hit and wound, a rend of -1, and a damage characteristic of 1. Though I'm sure a fair amount of you listening are quite familiar with where we should go from here, let's start by briefly entertaining the route you shouldn't take, that of computing max potential damage. One large pitfall less experienced players might make is to immediately multiply the attack's characteristic of a unit by its damage characteristic to see what the maximum potential output a single model can deliver would be. And though this technically isn't wrong, by ignoring the probabilistic steps in between, they're putting far too much trust in godlike dice rolls. So, if we were to go on max output alone, a single Phoenix Guard would be capable of inflicting 2 wounds on a given target, while a unit of 10 models, with their champion's extra attack, would be able to do 21 wounds. But without going into how the math plays out here for this video, trust me when I say that the statistical likelihood of this actually going off for the unit of 10, even before the opponent's saving throw, is statistically equivalent to 0. I've gone ahead and computed it here on the slide, just in case you still feel like taking your chances. Yes, that's a 4.019 times 10 to the -6%, which is very, very, very small and very close to 0. Hell, even just a single model's 2 attacks only have a 20% or so chance of both going through to the save stage. While we're not going to cover the math behind these calculations now, we have some amazingly informative ways to visualize how all this works, and we'll of course be sharing those in a more advanced video down the road. So this is where the expected value, or statistical average, comes into play as our much more realistic substitute for evaluating our troops' output. Without going into the theory here, the expected value is basically just the result we would find if we repeated these dice throws, let's say, thousands of times, and took their average. In fact, the more attempts we make, the closer that average gets to the computable value we're going to use. So if we have to reduce our metrics down to a single number, this would be the right one to go with. Though I'll introduce a faster, more streamlined way of computing these expected values in a future video, let's take a simple step-by-step approach with this first example to help the concept sink in. Essentially, we'll be thinking of each step on the weapon profile, from left to right, as a gatekeeping mechanism that quickly chisels away at our max potential damage, leaving us with only our desired and more reasonable expected value. As a sort of preliminary step, let's go ahead and remind ourselves of the chances of our 3s to hit and wound going off. As you're aware, a 3+ works on a 3, 4, 5, or 6. Thus, there's a 4 out of 6 chance that we pass through each of these stages. So our first step in the calculation will be starting with 2 attacks and multiplying them by the chance that our to hit roll is successful. In this case, a 3+ equates to a 4 out of 6 chance, so 2 times 4 over 6 leaves us with 8 over 6, or reduced 4 over 3. Now we move on to the to wound gate, where we once again have a 3+, which equates to multiplying our 4/3 once again, the number we found before, with 4 over 6, giving us a 16 over 18, or 8/9 when simplified. This means that before rend, on average, 8/9 of a single wound's worth of attacks will have gotten through to the save stage, not 8/9 of our maximum output of 2 attacks, mind you. If we were looking at it from that perspective, 89% or 8/9 of 1 wound would equate to only half that of 2 wounds, or roughly 44%, as you can see represented on the slide as a 0.44 wounds per attack. So even before the opponent gets to make any saving throws, our max output has already been cut down by more than 50% of its potential. Now, when I'm doing my analyses at home in my own battle tomes, this is roughly the stage where I stop, as the rend characteristic requires you knowing what your enemy's unit's save characteristic is. But in the interest of playing this through fully, let's examine all 6 of the following outcomes. Those where our opponent's unit has, after our unit's rend of -1, a save of 2+, 3+, 4+, 5+, 6+, or even 7+, so functionally no save. Since our unit has a rend of -1, this corresponds to our opponent having an effective save, i.e. after save buffs, of one better than each of those we just listed out, or to be crystal clear in the extreme cases, either a 1+ going to a 2+ after rend, or on the other side of the spectrum, a 6+ or worse going to no save after rend, as you can see in the chart. In the chart here, you'll see what our newly computed expected value would be for each of these 6 potential saves, and maybe you'll start to get an idea of why I don't like computing these at this step of the process. One might be quick to point out the somewhat quote-unquote industry standard of assuming a target has a 4+ save. But I find this drastically depends on the type of army you're playing against, the meta we're in, and how severe save stacking can be in the current rules. For example, we're likely about to head into a horde meta, where large blocks of infantry with poor saves might become much more common, and in that case, assuming the average save is a 4+ would lead to undervaluing some of your unit's potential output. In either case, once you finish computing either your pre-rend expected value or each of the 6 we've calculated here, you'll need to complete the job by post-multiplying your expected value by the damage characteristic. But since it's simply a 1 here in this case, the score doesn't change anything in our analysis. And while we're still on this slide, with all these crazy denominators in our fractions, I thought it might be good to just quickly talk about why I use some of the denominators and fractions that I'm using here, instead of simplifying every time. The general idea that I try to maintain over the course of my own math is to avoid using different denominators when possible, so I can more directly compare the numbers on top from one calculation to the next. Now you might say, well, Ryan, why don't you just convert to a decimal all the time? I usually do, but only at the end when I'm ready to lock my analysis into stone, if you will, set it in stone. Because at that point, there's no worry of rounding errors. If you're familiar with the concept, when you round something off as a fraction to 2 decimal places or even 5, 10 decimal places, technically there's a chance that you might end up having a rounding error that, if you keep using that same number over and over again, is going to keep getting worse over time. So by keeping a pure fraction that actually represents exactly the mathematical likelihood, you make it easier to be able to make sure that those rounding problems don't pop up. So if you think that my denominators are getting a little crazy, especially in some of the slides to come, just know that I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible without going too crazy on how big those fractions are, and those denominators in particular. If I can find a common denominator across a whole slide, I usually try to go with that. But let's go back to my way of notating things, which would be taking our pre-rend expected value multiplied by the damage characteristic at the end, and then afterwards including the amount of rend to be implied in parentheses, for ease of later computing the true expected value based on your target at a given moment based on their save characteristic. So at this point, we know that a single model could make precisely 0, 1, or 2 successful passes through the hit/wound rolls that would then be passed on to the enemy unit to save. So what does an output of 0.89 even mean? Well, one way of looking at it is that after rounding to the nearest whole numbers, a given model is more likely to get 1 attack through than either 0 or especially 2. But where this expected value really comes in handy is when we multiply it by the unit size. Speaking of which, since our champion has +1 attack on his weapon profile, which is half of the 2 attacks a normal model has, instead of multiplying the calculated expected value by an even 10, we're going to do so by 10.5 to represent the extra champion attack, giving us a total of 9.33 at -1 rend. And this is where you can see the value of getting our expected value as precise as possible, because if we had first rounded the expected value to the nearest whole number, in this case a 1, we would have computed 10.5 damage before the save stage, which is a whole 1 and 6 wounds higher than it should be. Now, while the value of 9.33 at a -1 rend might be helpful to have a sense for what your unit of 10 Phoenix Guard can do, it's not very easy to compare them to units with severely different points costs. So, to give us a better metric for doing so, we're going to divide this output by their current points cost as of pre-GHB 22, Part 1, of 175 points for 10 models, giving us an expected value per point of 0.053. This number, however, isn't super wieldy, so I prefer to convert it to output per 100 points, which is a relatively easy fraction of a 2,000 point army to work with. As such, the expected value per 100 points for our Phoenix Guard before save is 5.33. For those of you out there complaining that this isn't taking into account rend and save, I'll go ahead and supply that value against a 4-up save as well, in lieu of a more complicated metric I'll suggest in future videos. So that would be 5.33 times 4/6 equals 3.56 against a 4+ save. Of course, it's worth pointing out here, we don't need the -1 rend after it because we've already taken that into account, assuming that the save is a 4+. Now, let's talk about the slight downside to reinforcing. The astute amongst you might be aware that this computed value per 100 points doesn't scale fully when we reinforce the unit. In other words, make it 20 or 30 models instead of 10. While your gut might be telling you that this is on account of not all of the additional models being able to get into combat, though this is often an issue, it isn't a problem here, as our models are all on 25mm bases and have a range of 2 inches, generally meaning that they'll all get to fight if you maneuver them appropriately. So rather, what I'm referring to is the fact that while you do get to take extra standard bearers and musicians per every additional 10 models, you still only get to bring along a single champion, and thus his extra attack doesn't double or triple as the squad size does. In short, this means your expected value for 20 models gets multiplied by 20.5 and for 30 models by 30.5, not 21 and 31.5 respectively, and as such your output decreases marginally per reinforcement, as seen in the chart now on screen. Overall, you can see that the depreciation in value for a 1 times reinforced unit is only 2.38%, while that of a 2 times reinforced unit is 3.17. It's of course worth noting here that, like many of the results we'll find with our Phoenix Guard example, once the same math is applied to other units, the outcomes will vary. In summary, while reinforcing doesn't ultimately affect your output that much and certainly can have its benefits, especially with regards to buffs that can only go on one unit, it's good to keep in mind how the math actually plays out in the real world. After having computed these initial baseline expected values for your unit, you might be tempted to start wondering what happens if you buff them to hell with every trick your faction or sub-faction can deliver. Well, while this is of course possible to do, I tend to only like analyzing my units in light of what's relatively reliably easy for them to achieve in most of your games. So in that spirit, I'm only going to examine 2 potential buffs right now: the combat phase version of All-Out Attack, and the command ability from your hero buddies the Anointeds, called Captain of the Phoenix Guard. As you're all well aware, the All-Out Attack command ability gives one unit in the combat phase a +1 to hit, and of course your tanky Phoenix Guard might be a great option for this. That said, most decisions in Warhammer come as a trade-off, as using All-Out Attack on these guys means you won't be able to use it anywhere else. So while this buff definitely is always on the table, if you have a command point at least, I don't like to assume the unit will always be the one using it. But there's no harm in computing what their buffed output would be anyway, right? Right. So essentially, our to-hit roll goes from being a 3+ to a 2+, or from a 4 out of 6 chance to a 5 out of 6. Here's how that looks using our formula from earlier. So we see that their output has gone up from, before save, a 0.89 at -1 rend to a 1.11 at -1, or against a 4-up save from a 0.59 to a 0.74. And of course this scales for a unit of 10.5 models worth of attacks. In total, we're looking at a 25% performance increase for our dudes. Not bad at all. Now let's take a look at the impact of the Anointed's command ability called Captain of the Phoenix Guard, which buffs both his own attacks and those of his friends in the Phoenix Temple. While this command ability technically exists on both of the Phoenix mounted versions of the hero, I'm only going to assume that we're working with the foot version here for reasons you'll see in a minute. Though I often don't like dragging in outside Warscrolls when determining the damage output of a given unit, if there's a super obvious synergy buff coming from a related hero, I'll often compute that as well, just to see what the potential change is. After all, if you can take Cities of Sigmar as an ally, then at current points costs, you can still afford to take one block of Phoenix Guard with an Anointed on foot, so even without the City's Allegiance abilities, you'll still be able to pull off this combo. Okay, so what the Anointed's command ability does is create a 12-inch Wholly Within bubble of rerolling failed wound rolls for all Phoenix Temple units, including himself. While I don't want to go into the math here in this video, rerolling failed 3+ on a d6 equates to a 32 over 36 chance, up from a 2 out of 3 or 4 out of 6, or in this case 24 over 36 chance, so a 33% improvement, which is even better than that of the all-out attack we already saw on this unit. So repeating the math from before, we have the following. Now we've gone from a 0.89 at -1 to a 1.19 at -1 before save. Or, against a 4+ save, from a 0.59 to a 0.79. This is per model, of course, which then we can apply to a unit of 10 or 10.5 models worth of attacks. As mentioned before, we're looking at a 33% performance increase for our dudes. Even better. Once again, astute listeners out there in Strategoi land might be aware that these two command abilities, All-Out Attack and that of the Anointed, are in fact semi-stackable, as the Anointed version is issued and received by that hero, but then his bubble can stack with the All-Out Attack on the Phoenix Guard. So this leaves us with a +1 to hit and re-rolling failed wound rolls on a 3+. Extra juicy. And here's how the math looks for that calculation. So now we've gone Super Saiyan from a 0.89 at -1 rend before save to a 1.48 at -1. Or against a 4+ save from a 0.59 to a 0.99. And again, this scales for a unit of 10.5 models worth of attacks, leaving us with a massive 67% performance increase in our dudes. Yikes. Now, of course, it's worth pointing out that to achieve this stunning feat, we'll also have to blow not 1, but 2 command points per combat phase. So this isn't exactly sustainable, but it is certainly within the realm of possibility, and considering our guys are battle shock immune around their anointed hero, you won't be needing to save that CP for Inspiring Presence. So we've just covered 3 possible buff combinations, all of which raise our Deathbound Elves' value for their points. But let's take a look at this chart to see how all 4 states, including their non-buffed base state, compare to one another. With a quick glance, the value per 100 points results are looking pretty great, and we can clearly see a strictly improving hierarchy of buffs, right? Going from no buffs to all-out attack to reroll fail wound rolls with the command ability to, of course, both. Well, let's not get too hasty. While the first 2 situations, their baseline profile and +1 to hit, don't require the Anointed on foot to join the fun, the last 2 options do, but we've conveniently left out his points cost, and of course attack profile as well, from the calculations. So, seeing as he currently costs 110 points and has the same profile as Phoenix Guard, but with 4 attacks instead of 2, let's go ahead and let him fight as well, and with his 2-inch reach, it's probably within reason to say that he can make it as well. Keeping in mind that he will be able to receive his own command ability, but not the all-out attack. So here's our chart with all those values taken into account. As you can see, while the first 2 states don't actually require the Anointed, and thus he wasn't included in the computations, the second 2 do, and this makes a difference in our points efficiency scores. Yes, the Anointed does buff up our unit and make them super killy, but he doesn't make your points worth more, at least not with regards to output potential. Rather, this is where you have to weigh what other secret sauce he might be bringing to the table, including perhaps being your general, thereby allowing the Phoenix Guard to be battle line and double reinforceable, being able to take command traits or artifacts, having access to heroic actions, being able to dispel and unbind spells or endless spells, and of course also having a 4+ ward himself. And there we have it, a fairly detailed breakdown of one Warscroll's offensive combat potential. And naturally, we'll be covering the defensive half of the equation in our upcoming follow-up video, so do stay tuned for that. As for the secret sauce, as we mentioned in our Intro to MathHammer video, not every part of a unit's Warscroll will be quantifiable, and thus not directly analyzable with probability theory and statistics. At the end of the day, that's what your own judgment as an experienced player is for, and beyond that, what strategy and list building videos like those found on the rest of this channel can bring to the table, pun intended. My main goal in these 2 videos is to give you an example of how I would begin breaking down a given unit before doing even heavier comparisons between them and the other units in their own book. But though this approach might be too detailed for what many of you out there are looking for, it gives us a good look into what's possible, right? Both in terms of your own Warscroll analysis and also with respect to the future videos in this series. I mean, how many times did I end up saying something to the effect of, let's save the math for later, but just trust me on this, okay? As always, if anything isn't crystal clear, feel free to comment below or post questions to the Discord, where Jonas and I will be happy to keep the conversation going. And don't forget to share, like, and subscribe as well, as we're trying to get the good news of MathHammer out to as many people as possible, not just Lumineth or even Age of Sigmar players, but anyone that could find this type of analysis helpful in their games of chance. Once again, thanks so much for your support for both this channel at large and this MathHammer series, and until next time, may the probability gods be ever in your favor. Ryan out.